So as you could probably see, I'm going to be talking to you about cognitive and personality correlates of perception of externalized sound in VR. So, without further ado. So I started off looking at distance perception in VR because that's quite a common thing to look at, and it seemed like there was some interesting things that I could explore to do with the bimodal nature of the medium. So I did a lot of experiments where I got people to play a game, and in the game you had to, through various methods, estimate how far away things were. And afterwards, after each trial, there was a debrief where I took some quality of experience metrics that were taken from various papers, which you'll see at the end, mainly to do with audiovisual capture, otherwise known as the ventriloquist effect, sense of localization, not absolute localization performance, but how more like source width, how narrow or easy to localize a source is. Plausibility, does it sound like it's in the space that you've been shown? Awareness that the sound was coming from the headphones. This is something that trying to capture something that's in VR to do with presence. It's to do with, and the maxim is that the experience of presence can be measured by realistic behavior. So if you're not aware that you're listening to a synthetic source, the idea is, oh, well, you can sort of assume that the person is accepting what they're hearing and seeing as a valid source. And of course, externalization. So is it coming from outside the head? And I found a weird thing. This was an anomalous result. So here we've got a mixture between stimuli which have either no late reverb or some late reverb, and it's cut up into early impulse response conditions. So these first four all have head-related transfer functions applied to the direct sound and different orders of early reflection. What you can see is that the medians don't really change, and when there is no processing, no HRTF, you've just got stereo sound, sometimes with, sometimes without late reverb, 50% of the participants still said, yep, totally outside my head, which is weird. That's not what you expect. You expect what the other 50% of the people were doing and saying, there's no spectral cues, there's no ITD cues, this is not externalized. However, some people were totally convinced. So I did some work looking at the effect of the degree of obviousness of audio and visual co-location. And that's part of it, but that's not the subject of this. The subject of this is, if you were to measure two rooms, you wouldn't use a capacitor mic in one room and a ribbon mic in the other. You'd get different results, and you'd go, hey, these rooms sound completely, the measurement's completely different. And that's kind of what people are doing when they're doing perceptual tests, especially in VR with multimodal stuff. People are just assuming that everything is in the signal domain and not in the receiver domain. So overall, I found, by the power of PCA, that there were three of these factors, these questions, that were more or less loaded onto each other, and they all relate to how realistic people perceived it to have been an audiovisual source to have been represented in the space. Externalization and being aware that you're listening to a set of headphones were inversely related to each other, but pretty much independent of the realism of the source, which is interesting. Why is it? So the question that I was asking is, could it be related to some intrinsic factor within the people, some variation within the sample, rather than variation within the stimuli? So I looked at various metrics. There are some people who, it suggested to me that I look at some personality stuff. First thing were the first two of what's known as the Big Five. It's also the same as Eisenach's two-factor model, which are extroversion and neuroticism. These have not shown to have any relation to perception of stuff in VR. And it's mainly presence. It's where when people have done studies where they give people some sort of VR experience, say how did you really feel like you were there, and then get them to fill out some tests of various types designed to measure their personalities. And the things that came out were, the first one is immersive tendencies. Now, this is a synthetic construct. This was done by a group of people in the mid-90s. The names have escaped me, but it's at the end of the presentation. And so they basically gave people VR experiences and then asked them a load of questions, and they found the ones which correlated mostly with sensitive presence, and they break them down to 4 scales. Involvement, how much you allow yourself to become involved in things like narratives, like do you find yourself getting absorbed in books and films, stuff like that. Focus, your ability to concentrate on the thing in front of you and block out distracting things. Emotion is, I don't know, they labeled it, not me, but the amount of emotionality people have. And because this was done in the 90s and computers weren't as widespread as they are now, how much you engage with video games was found to be a significant factor. Later on, there was another study done, which was the purpose of this was to try and validate some of these many scales that people have come out. They found that empathy, the degree to which you experience other people's emotions when you see them, is also a corollary of experiencing presence in VR. And I wanted to know, are these also related to the experience of not necessarily presence, but if you hear a sound and it's been rendered in a space, do these things sort of predict whether or not you're lying that top 50% who hear unrendered sound and say, hey, yeah, that's super realistic, or not? There were some other things I looked at. So on the tool that I used for measuring empathy is actually part of a two-factor model. So it's empathizing and systematization. So these come part and parcel together in the tests that you use, and that's a measure of how much the want of it's basically a nerdiness test. That's the way, if you can say it in a sentence, how much you take information, categorize it, how much you're interested in the way things work, systems. There was another thing that I thought that hadn't been looked at, but I thought could be relevant, and that was the global and local precedence effect. This is based on a multi-pass theory of human visual perception, which I can explain here. So this is what's called a Navon embedded figure, and this is a incongruent condition. You have a large figure, H, made up of smaller figures, S's, and 50% of the time you'll either be asked to report or respond with what's the large figure or what's the small figure. What's the global figure, what's the local figure. And the multipass sort of theory states that you'll perceive the large figure first. Then, the longer you look at it, you'll perceive the local features. And different people do this at different speeds. You get a ratio, and depends whether which one's the denominator and which one's the numerator. I've got it such that larger numbers, as they get closer to 1, means that there is a smaller difference between your local and global processing time. So if you've got a higher number in a statistic, it means you can resolve local features faster. If you've got a lower, it means you have to look at something for longer in order to resolve the local features accurately. So the test that I did, I had rooms, which we'll see in a second. Audio was either played from headphones or the speakers. It was either rendered with a simple geometric model, or the type of which is used in video game development, VR. It's not supposed to be a good model. It's not supposed to be sophisticated. It's supposed to represent what is out there and what people are using to make the things that people are buying and using and stuff like that. But also used measurements done in the listening room and in the audio booth by Rick, and they were rendered using off-the-shelf ambisonic decoder, which has recently just been made open source, so you can now see inside it. But when I did these experiments, I couldn't. But that's an aside. For the purposes of maybe looking at the data in a different way, and also keeping in track with looking at the effect of visual cues, you could either see the room and the speakers, or just the room, or nothing at all. And these are the environments that we had. So on the top is the spaces in which the people actually were when they were doing the experiments, and these are the spaces which were being presented to them when the experiment was happening. Effort was made to keep things in the right place and make sure people were sort of positionally tracked, so that if you sat down one place, if you sat down here in the real world, you were sat in the same place in the virtual world. So, because we've got essentially a signal detection problem, can you detect the auralized sound from the really real sound? We can do signal detection metrics, which is great. However, what we find out is that signal detection theory is good for when you have things that are very, very similar. So it's been used for people, see if people can detect the difference between a model and a measurement, let's say. So everything's on headphones. So any artifacts produced by the headphones, you're controlling for more stuff. In this particular case, only one participant was unable to tell the difference between simulation and reality. Most of the participants were between 51% chance of getting it right and 98%. Another artifact of signal detection is that like all statistics, the power is based on the number of samples, but as you get higher and higher degrees of sensitivity, small difference make a really big difference, and you get infinities, which lead to nans and infinities in your data. So you have to cap it somewhere by truncating zeros and infinities to some very small, very large number. The number that you choose affects the output. So basically, once you get above 98% detection probability, you just say, perfect, because they might have like one or two actual samples which are right or which are wrong or right, which will make a difference, which has a huge effect. What's interesting though, these 75% that in this sort of useful range had a bias of less than 1. So bias, people measure bias in signal detection in lots of different ways. I chose this statistic called C. If you want to know more about how these are calculated, there is a very good paper by Stanislaw and Todorov, which I recommend you read, because it basically covers them all, and it does it really comprehensively, more than I've got time to do here. But basically, a high value of C in this case means that if the person doesn't know, they are likely to just choose the speakers. If they have a negative value of C, if the person doesn't know, they are likely to choose the headphones. And this is expressed in standard deviation. So if you've got a C of +1, you've got if you don't know, that person is 68% likely to choose the speakers rather than the headphones. Then you've got this other 25% with very, very high signal detection sensitivity. However, in all but one case, this was associated with high bias. So this high sensitivity is actually an artifact caused by either always choosing speakers, no matter what they've given, with some small, with a little bit of randomness in there, are always choosing headphones. And so you can't really trust these people's sensitivity, but it's interesting because it's actually impossible to tell from this statistic whether this results from a perceptual bias or a response bias. And the distinction being a perceptual bias is if you're given a load of noise and you see a signal, you've got a perceptual bias for seeing one thing or the other, or a response bias is, I don't know, speakers. I don't know, speakers. Speakers. And using these statistics, you can't actually find that out, what the difference is. So I think I probably covered this. Okay, so yeah, there were differences. So signal detection can only really tell you if someone can tell the difference between reality and not. It's a binary thing. If you, like with anything with a p-value, it's been suggested that you have a d prime of like 0.177, and that gives you 5% above chance of choosing the right answer, so then you can't tell the difference. That doesn't help if you're trying to see if there's any continuous or small differences between two sets. And so we go back to more traditional frequentist analysis, which is Pearson's chi-square test of association. And we find that we do, yes. So the measured impulse responses do perform better, with small effect size, no, medium effect size in this case, than the modelled responses, which is what you'd expect, but people can still, on the whole, discern it from reality. In the case of visual conditions, being able to see the room, but not the speakers, made the modelled responses less plausible. Being able to see nothing made the modelled responses more plausible, and that effect wasn't seen in the measurements. But that just basically shows that there's variation in this one cognitive sort of parameter that I'm measuring. What I did then is take the perceptual metrics that I showed you at the beginning, perform PCA on them to see if we had the similar results before. And we kind of do, but slightly different. So these are the quality of experience metrics for when people believed that they were listening to a loudspeaker, right? And in the blue here, these aren't entered into the PCA. They're put in raw as what are called supplementary variables. So that's correlating against these extracted dimensions. And so what you can see is that this second dimension here, which we've got, it's about 28% of the variation in the data, has a loading of about 0.4 onto aural sensitivity, which is associated with externalisation. So it's kind of like the analysis that I'm doing isn't really to extract the latent variables like you would normally do with a PCA. This is sort of like a creative way of exploring the correlation matrix of the data. So we can see that at a correlation of about 0.3, low systematization is associated with high externalization for when you believe you're listening to a real source. And the thing that pulls down externalization here is aural sensitivity. So the better you are at getting it right that it is a real source, the more likely you are to report a high level of externalization. And that is, as before, it's independent of the audiovisual capture, so the ventriloquist effect, and the perceived plausibility. So plausibility itself, which is interesting because signal detection theory has been used as a metric of plausibility. But here, signal detection, the ability to tell the difference between the two, isn't anything to do with your perception that the sound of the room sounds like the room that you're in. You get what I'm saying? However, we've got this condition. We've got this thing where people with high bias are responding differently to the way with low bias. So when there's low bias, so if you're in that useful range of people where you're actually engaging with the experiment properly, or the sense of localization is related to the sense of plausibility and audiovisual capture. However, you can see here that in a case of high bias, localization is more associated with externalization. So those people, if they're in this case, remember, high bias is always choosing the speakers, whatever. They're perceiving, in this interpretation, they're perceiving an external source. When they believe it's a loudspeaker, they believe it's impinging on the virtual world rather than being a real source within the virtual world. And so again, for when people rate as headphones, you can see that high sensitivity is associated with low perceived plausibility. So if you're more likely to get it right, you're going to give a low rating for environmental plausibility when you say it's headphones. I haven't included it in this presentation, but I did one analysis where I looked at the difference on this dimension, with all the data together, the differences on this dimension when people responded for headphones and speakers, and I found that difference is highly correlated with C. So the amount, the different values that you give for speakers and headphones describes what people are listening for. And if you give them the same responses for, it was on the headphones and you give everything a 4, and I thought when it was on the speakers I give everything a 4, you're more likely to have a low bias. And if you're giving everything on the loudspeakers 7s and everything on the headphones 1s, then you're more likely to be one of these high bias people who have made a decision either way. And so the C is sometimes known as the estimated decision criteria. So that analysis kind of makes sense. So we can look again at the low bias subjects, and you can see that they respond different overall, and that high sensitivity is related to low externalization. So people with low aural sensitivity are more likely to say that they hear it in the headphones, but I'm still experiencing it as being externalized, which relates back to the stuff we were looking at the beginning. The interesting thing is that when people are rating things as in the loudspeakers, the global precedence, and I mean it's related to it, but global precedence and empathy don't really come into it. However, when people are rating things in the headphones, so this is attention to media. I don't know. It's difficult because we've got this sort of kind of decorrelated matrix, but there's something going on here. These only become salient when people are experiencing things as being synthetic sources. And so, in the low bias condition, which I've covered, in the high bias condition, you got a much more clear-cut extraction of dimensions. You've got much more independence between externalization and perception of realism here. So, overall, in conclusions, the independence of the quality of experience is partly a function of how people perceive things. You know, if they perceive it as being real or perceive it as being headphones, whether they're right or wrong or not. When people believe it's a real sound, if they've got a high bias, they're more likely to associate localization with how much they're externalizing. When they're in a condition of low bias, that sense of localization is more to do with the visual component, what they've been shown in the world, how the VE is rendered, and whether or not they're associating the sound with a source. And as I said there, for when you put things in the headphones, if you've got a high level of bias, one way or the other, you give much more independent responses to the quality of experience. So, yes, when perceived as a real source, overall, oral sensitivity and low systematization and empathy may have some predictive power for ratings of externalization. When perceived as a synthetic source, low oral sensitivity is associated with higher ratings of plausibility and externalization, despite the knowledge that the source is not real. And global precedence and immersive tendencies are unrelated to ratings of perceived real sources. It's only when people sort of think that they're listening to something synthetic that these factors come into play in the perception of the VE. Thanks. Any questions? Yes.
For example, we did an experiment of spatialization.
Yeah, I think it's something to do with it's something to do with whether you're attending to the visual or not. And again, I think it's that either whether it's a perceptual bias or whether it's just a response bias, there are some people who are expecting to respond to a certain thing. I think you joked, didn't you? Like empathic people, want to make you feel good, so they're giving you useless but feel good data. I mean, that might be coming into it. But the whole point of this study kind of was to demonstrate that treating human subjects as a homogeneous blob and just saying like people respond in this way, is not entirely valid. There are differences that if you're doing subjective tests, you may have to start recording certain either perceptual, cognitive, or personality traits to account for what would otherwise be considered noise in a model, and may, I don't know, again, this is future work stuff, but may reduce residual size when you're looking at correlation studies. Mm. But I mean, if you're in a position where you could maybe still use their data but in a different way, I don't know, if you collect enough of those people who are useless and and then use it to prove a point, I don't know. It's beyond the scope of me. Ethically, I don't even know. Due to my ability to forget things from literally 10 minutes ago, it's now a double-blind study. So.
Two more quick points if I may. One is, when you go through the presentation, I found...
Yeah.
You go through actually...
Yeah.